In 1945, the United States forged the atomic bomb, swiftly employing it to help conclude the Second World War. Yet, the advent of the Cold War ushered in fresh anxieties. Both Soviet and American strategists held cataclysmic power at their fingertips, yet wrestled with the dilemma of employing it without precipitating global annihilation. A fundamental query emerged: could victory be achieved in a nuclear conflict? The development of atomic weaponry in the 1940s fundamentally upended the prevailing strategic and military balance among major nations. The United States, in 1945, laid bare the profoundly destructive potential of even rudimentary atomic arms. By 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own bomb, striving to bridge a growing technological and military chasm between the superpowers. Despite this, U.S. President Harry Truman displayed hesitancy in formalizing his stance. For him, these bombs were not merely tools of war, but instruments of political coercion, reserved exclusively for the direst exigencies. Truman made it clear that authorization for deploying atomic weapons rested solely with the president. You must comprehend that this is not a weapon of warfare. It is utilized to eliminate women, children, and unarmed individuals, and not for military purposes. While some reservations lingered, the U.S. persisted in augmenting its arsenals and enhancing delivery capabilities. Truman assured his military advisors that he would not shy away from deploying the bomb if necessary. Soviet strategy experienced marginal alteration upon its own bomb's development. In 1946, Stalin even asserted that the bomb was a source of fear primarily for the faint-hearted. I do not consider the atomic bomb as formidable a force as certain politicians tend to believe. Atomic bombs are meant to intimidate the weak-willed, yet they cannot determine the outcome of a conflict, being entirely unsuitable for such a purpose. Following the atomic bombings of 1945, Stalin adopted a belligerent and unyielding stance to demonstrate resilience in the face of American intimidation. Once the Soviet Union achieved its atomic capabilities in 1949, Stalin promptly integrated them into the Red Army's inventory. His World War II-derived principles of war, known as the 5 perpetually operative factors, remained unaltered. These factors prioritized the morale, quantity, quality, and logistical support for conventional ground forces, along with the stability of the rear. Then, in 1953, a transformative shift ensued. In the United States, President Dwight Eisenhower succeeded Truman, while in the Soviet Union, Stalin passed away, and Nikita Khrushchev ascended to the role of first secretary after a power struggle. These leadership transitions coincided with technological advancements. On November 1, 1952, the U.S. successfully detonated the first hydrogen thermonuclear weapon. Within hydrogen bombs, a fusion of hydrogen atoms is triggered by a fission reaction, akin to atomic bombs, releasing even more formidable energy in an explosion. Hydrogen bombs could be orders of magnitude more potent than atomic weapons, earning the moniker "city killers." The implications were not lost on UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who remarked, "There exists a vast chasm between the atomic and hydrogen bomb." The hydrogen bomb has fundamentally revolutionized the underpinnings of human affairs, plunging humanity into a realm both quantifiable and laden with foreboding. In less than a year following the U.S. test, the Soviets conducted their own hydrogen bomb test, albeit without deployable capability. Beyond their enhanced potency, hydrogen bombs were also notably smaller than atomic bombs, affording novel delivery avenues and strategic possibilities. Khrushchev and Eisenhower encountered parallel pressures. Both sought to curtail military expenditures, and nuclear armaments seemed to offer an avenue for achieving this goal. Strategic nuclear weapons could ostensibly deliver comparable military might more economically than maintaining massive conventional forces. Eisenhower also grappled with the need to counterbalance the Soviet Union's significant conventional advantage. He observed, "We were aware that the Soviets maintained approximately 175 divisions in Europe at all times. The United States possessed 20 divisions, with just 5 in Europe. Therefore, given the disparity in the strength of opposing ground forces, it appeared evident that our nuclear armaments were the sole means of promptly halting significant communist aggression in that theater." Nonetheless, Eisenhower inherited some of Truman's perspectives on nuclear weapons. He regarded triumph and defeat in a nuclear conflict as fundamentally equivalent, as he conveyed to a group of advisors, "The only conceivable tragedy beyond prevailing in a nuclear conflict would be suffering defeat." Consequently, in October 1953, Eisenhower formulated a new-look policy. He publicly proclaimed his willingness to employ nuclear weapons akin to conventional ordnance, though his genuine intention lay in deterrence. The United States would integrate nuclear weapons into a doctrine of massive retaliation, refraining from a preemptive strike. In the event of a Soviet or Allied attack, an American nuclear rejoinder would render any Soviet aggression futile. The U.S. also diversified its delivery platforms, encompassing submarines and fortified silos. These measures ensured that even in the event of a Soviet first strike, the U.S. could retaliate with assured destruction. Eisenhower gambled on the notion that Soviet leaders, notwithstanding their ideological differences, remained rational individuals, disinclined to instigate a cataclysm. While the U.S. rested upon the premise of a potential nuclear response to forestall war, the Soviet Union adopted an alternate approach. Certain scholars suggest that the English concept of deterrence lacks a precise Russian linguistic equivalent, and Soviet nuclear strategy was entrenched within the Red Army's offensive tradition. Thus, the Soviets devised strategies not solely for waging a nuclear war, but for triumphing in one. For the USSR, warfare constituted both a societal and political contest, as well as a military endeavor. Consequently, Soviet military doctrine adhered to political precepts, operating within the framework of Marxist-Leninist principles. These tenets posited that warfare could serve as a mechanism for profound social transformation, and any conflict between capitalist and socialist nations would inevitably culminate in socialist triumph. Guided by these principles, the notion of an unwinnable war, as postulated by Eisenhower, became untenable. Nonetheless, Soviet political doctrine maintained that solely imperialist, capitalist states initiated wars, even though it remained evident that the side initiating a nuclear conflict would enjoy a significant advantage. To circumvent this conundrum, the Soviets focused on preemptive strikes. They would launch their nuclear arsenal only when convinced of an imminent U.S. assault. The aim was to neutralize enemy military forces, including nuclear weapons, disrupt their rear operations, and undermine their will to resist. Acknowledging the implausibility of entirely eradicating the adversary's strategic nuclear weaponry, Soviet authorities underscored robust civil defense measures to minimize the repercussions of a retaliatory U.S. strike. This approach necessitated the maintenance of constantly vigilant strategic nuclear forces. In 1961, Marshal Rod Ion Malinowski, the Minister of Defense, articulated this imperative. A realistic evaluation of the situation leads one to conclude that the imperialists are preparing a surprise nuclear attack on the USSR and socialist countries. Thus, Soviet military doctrine regards it as the most paramount, preeminent, and primary task of the armed forces to remain in a perpetual state of preparedness to effectively repel an adversary's surprise assault and thwart their nefarious designs. The newly established Soviet strategic rocket forces assumed responsibility for this crucial decisive strike. Initially, strategic bombers such as the Tu-20 Bear and M4 Bison held prominence, yet the United States' considerable distance rendered reliance on slower bombers impractical. Providentially for the Soviets, substantial strides in rocketry were achieved throughout the 1950s, exemplified by the launch of Sputnik in 1957. During that same year, the Soviet Union introduced their inaugural intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM. Intense rivalry between the US and USSR, particularly concerns about a potential missile gap, spurred both nations to escalate their nuclear weaponry stockpiles. By 1960, the US enjoyed a distinct advantage, possessing 18,000 bombs compared to the Soviet Union's 1,600. It's imperative to recognize, as underscored by certain US analysts, that acknowledging the feasibility of nuclear victory does not equate to endorsing its desirability. Any prospective Soviet nuclear triumph would yield a Pyrrhic victory, entailing incomprehensible devastation. The lens of Soviet doctrine must be shaped by their experiences in the Second World War, where inadequate preparation culminated in horrific losses during Germany's assault. Nuclear weapons expert Tariq Rauf postulated that the Soviet approach functioned as a distinct form of deterrence. The Soviets do not require a direct articulation of deterrence to implement it. The leadership of the Soviet Union acknowledges that nuclear warfare would entail an unparalleled catastrophe for socialism. Nonetheless, the Soviets have consistently upheld the belief that the most effective method of deterring war is to be prepared to wage it, should deterrence falter. Despite the genuine intentions of the Soviet Union, the strategy of preemptive strikes harbored profound perils. Miscommunication, misinterpretation of intelligence, or technical glitches could all potentially trigger a Soviet preemptive strike. Consequently, throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, both the US and USSR devised nuclear strategies, America's predicated on overwhelming response, and the Soviets centered on preemption. Nevertheless, Cold War tensions and emerging technologies swiftly compelled strategists to reassess their approaches. The early 1960s ushered in a sequence of crises that subjected the strategies of both the US and USSR to rigorous testing. The 1961 Berlin crisis and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis pushed both sides to the brink of implementing their respective war plans, carrying the potential for catastrophic outcomes. Fortunately, reason prevailed, yet on both sides of the Iron Curtain, a realization dawned that their post-World War II strategies exhibited notable inflexibility. Nuclear armaments had not extinguished the conflict between the US and the USSR, rather, they had transposed it to different arenas, as seen in Cuba and Vietnam. In response, political leaders and military commanders sought a more versatile array of options. Collaborating with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, President John Kennedy formulated the concept of flexible response, a comprehensive framework encompassing conventional military, political, economic, and nuclear alternatives. The objective was to enable Western forces within the NATO alliance to engage in operations without necessarily triggering direct nuclear retaliation from the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. While nuclear weapons remained a consideration, their initial usage would be confined to demonstration or against exclusively military targets. In 1962, McNamara articulated that the US would refrain from targeting Soviet cities if the Soviets reciprocated. However, this proposition was fraught with practical challenges, given that numerous military installations are situated in proximity to urban centers. Simultaneously, the US established its strategic triad, which comprised intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, strategic bombers, and submarines. This multifaceted arsenal aimed to convey to the Soviets that a preemptive strike would prove futile, as some form of US nuclear capability would endure a first strike by the Soviets. Shifts in attitudes were also discernible within the USSR. Leonid Brezhnev, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, began to downplay the feasibility of winning a war and emphasized bolstering conventional forces, a strategy he termed, "speak softly while carrying a big stick." By 1968, the Soviet military journal Communist of the Armed Forces elucidated the Soviet perspective. The point is that the new avenues for waging armed conflict, pertaining to conventional forces, have emerged not despite, but due to, the existence of nuclear missile weaponry. Technological advancements once again played a role in shaping developments during the 1970s. In the early 1970s, ICBMs equipped with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, MIRVs, significantly augmented the destructive potential of a single ICBM. By 1975, the USSR had caught up with the US, possessing 20,000 nuclear warheads compared to the US's 27,000. This convergence led Soviet leaders to consider the likelihood of an unprovoked US attack against the USSR as remote, rendering their preemption strategies obsolete. Moreover, financial constraints played a role, prompting discussions on arms limitations. In 1972, the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 1 allowed both superpowers to complete the construction of existing launchers and warheads but prohibited the development of new ones. By 1976, Brezhnev adopted an optimistic outlook stating, "Although global peace is not yet guaranteed, we have substantial grounds to assert with confidence that the improvement in the international atmosphere provides convincing evidence that the attainment of enduring peace is not merely an aspiration but a realistic goal." While the 1972 Arms Treaty infused hope, its impact varied among different entities. These limitation treaties primarily concerned intercontinental strategic nuclear weapons targeted at nuclear states, leaving non-nuclear states in Europe apprehensive. Challenges in monitoring treaties and persisting mutual distrust between superpowers hindered progress. The US withdrew from further negotiations following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the revelation of Soviet troops in Cuba. Similarly, the US, Britain, and France declined to reciprocate a Soviet no first use policy, regarding it as Soviet propaganda. Some analysts posit that the Soviets aimed to use the no first use pledge to support conventional operations, given the unlikelihood of requiring nuclear weapons in a conventional attack. Despite Soviet restraint, NATO remained cognizant of the pivotal role of nuclear weapons. Military leaders on both sides upheld nuclear armaments as an essential component of their strategies. NATO forces routinely trained in nuclear biological chemical protective gear, anticipating the possibility of a nuclear battlefield. Both sides developed equipment resistant to radiation, such as hermetically sealed tanks, underscoring the anticipation of a nuclear-engaged battlefield. The Soviet Union envisaged employing a nuclear barrage in a Europe-wide conflict. Numerous plans were formulated during this era. A Soviet simulation of a West German invasion, named 7 Days to the Rhine, initiated with nuclear strikes on Italy, West Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Some plans even included strikes on neutral Austria. The intention was to disrupt NATO rear areas and ports while sparing capitals to coerce governmental surrender. Subsequent to the devastation, conventional Warsaw Pact forces would occupy the affected nations and advance toward the Rhine. The Soviets opted to exclude France, the US, and Britain from nuclear strikes, likely to avert nuclear retaliation and lay the groundwork for diplomatic negotiations. However, it is conceivable that any Soviet strike on a NATO ally would provoke a comprehensive response. It's noteworthy that the Soviet conception of this plan emerged in response to a hypothetical NATO nuclear first strike in Poland and Czechoslovakia as a precursor to a NATO invasion of East Germany. Disagreement persists regarding the seriousness of these plans, although they were indeed disseminated among Warsaw Pact members. As the world entered the 1980s, both sides found themselves grappling with the absence of a viable strategy. The concept of mutually assured destruction offered no room for maneuvering, while flexible responses introduced a multitude of unknown variables and the potential for uncontrollable escalation. The stark reality was that a widespread nuclear conflict had become an unwinnable proposition. Despite this, military strategists were compelled to seek pathways toward achieving victory. Reflecting on these paradoxes in 1983, U.S. Ambassador to NATO Harland Cleveland remarked, "Nuclear weapons have turned out to be ultimate in an unanticipated sense of the word." This may be the most important thing about nuclear weapons in the 1980s, that they are militarily unusable. The year 1983 also witnessed heightened tension and two critical near-miss incidents. In September, the Soviets downed a Korean Air passenger plane that had entered restricted airspace. Later that same month, a malfunction in the Soviet early warning system falsely indicated the approach of 5 U.S. ICBMs toward the Soviet Union, despite the absence of any such missiles. Stanislav Petrov, the engineer on duty, deviated from protocol and refrained from triggering an alarm, a decision that likely averted a nuclear exchange and the loss of millions of lives. Subsequently, in November 1983, NATO conducted an exercise named Able Archer, simulating a nuclear attack on Western Europe. This move raised suspicions within the Soviet Union that the exercise masked an actual preparation for war, prompting the Soviets to prepare their nuclear forces for imminent retaliation. Although NATO chose not to respond to Soviet military activity, the exercise concluded without incident. These incidents highlighted the fact that the stability of deterrence was not always assured, particularly during periods of heightened tension. The realization that deterrence was not foolproof, coupled with the escalating costs of maintaining substantial conventional and nuclear forces, signaled a shift in approach. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the USSR embarked on economic and social reforms aimed at opening Soviet society. This period coincided with a renewal of arms limitation agreements. The official TASS news agency captured the essence of these changes under Gorbachev's leadership: a nuclear war is impermissible. There can be no victors. A mutual understanding of this question has been recorded on the summit level. Practical conclusions should be drawn from it. Growing public apprehension regarding nuclear weapons further pushed policymakers away from contemplating the prospects of nuclear war. Movies and literature began portraying the apocalyptic potential of nuclear weapons in a new light, depicting nuclear war as a catastrophic event affecting all people regardless of their political beliefs. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 further underscored the perils associated with unchecked nuclear capabilities, potentially hastening the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. Shortly before its collapse in 1991, the US and USSR signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the most comprehensive accord of its kind at that time. Both countries committed to reducing their stockpiles to 6,000 nuclear warheads each, resulting in the decommissioning of 80% of existing nuclear weapons by 2001. Nevertheless, the stability of deterrence remains a topic of intense debate. Advocates argue that deterrence serves to prevent further conflict, while critics contend that such a benefit is not guaranteed in the face of future uncertainties and emerging crises. There is also a pronounced moral aversion to the concept of mutual destruction, spurred by concerns related to globalization, climate change, and international tensions. This sentiment is not novel. As early as 1962, President Kennedy observed that nuclear weapons gambled present security against the future's well-being, leading to a pessimistic geopolitical landscape. He remarked, "World order will be secured only when the whole world has laid down these weapons which seem to offer us present security but threaten the future survival of the human race." The vast resources on this planet are being devoted more and more to the means of destroying, instead of enriching human life, but the world was not meant to be a prison in which man awaits his execution. More recently, new countries have acquired or come close to obtaining nuclear weapons, while nations like North Korea and Russia have openly made threats of their potential use. The so-called nuclear club now comprises 9 members, each with distinct policies and strategies concerning their nuclear capabilities. For most members, including North Korea and Israel, nuclear weapons represent a means of coercion and protection against real or perceived existential threats. However, the proliferation of nuclear weapons also amplifies deterrence-based relationships across the global stage, along with the associated risks. The question of whether a future nuclear war can be won remains both an open and ominous inquiry.